I want to talk about climate change and conflict today. A lot of people don't often put those two concepts together. I want to talk about how they are starting to show up more and more frequently and why it is important for Africa to be cognizant of these trends. In that, I want to highlight not necessarily the conflict, nor the environment, but the role of people. And that's why it's an important topic. It's not the environment by itself, because if people weren't around and the environment changed, well, would it really matter that much? What matters is how it affects people. And it's going to affect the people of Africa more than any other place in the world. Oops. First of all, let me talk about the context for the times we live in. And this is an era that a lot of historians call the Great Acceleration. And if we look at indicators of world development across a variety of dimensions, dating back to the first industrial revolution, we will see that things had been growing at a small but constant rate for many centuries and millennia. But now they're taking off in a way that we have never experienced before. I know this is a little hard to see, but these are all graphs showing a bunch of differing economic, demographic, and environmental indicators over the last couple hundred years, and how they're really reaching an apogee at this point in history. So the first one there is just human populations. Human population did not exceed 1 billion until about the year 1900. Now we've exceeded 7 billion. It took us 40,000 years to get to the first billion. Now we're doing it in about every 10 years. Below that, the percentage of the world that is urbanized. Now over 50% of the world's populations live in cities. This was never the case in history before. This alone presents a variety of environmental and climate challenges. Real GDP has also exploded across the world. Economies are growing at a rate not seen before in history, across the entire planet, and not just in parts of it. Foreign direct investment, which is an indicator of globalization, is also splurging. Primary energy use, and of course this relates to climate change, is tremendously increasing in line with these other trends. To feed a growing population, we need more fertilizer, and therefore fertilizer consumption is growing at a very fast rate. To provide water for all these people, we're building more dams than we have ever built in history, and using water at a rate unsurpassed. Finally, even the amount of information, and I'm using an old indicator here called paper production in the right-hand corner there, is growing, and this is despite the computer revolution. We're still producing more paper than ever. So we live in this time of the Great Acceleration where things are kind of linking together and growing faster and faster on economic, demographic, and environmental dimensions. And these trends are interrelated. Before I start talking about climate, I want to talk about what are some of the assumptions that go into climate forecasts. You're probably all familiar with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN-affiliated body that every 4 years comes out with new reports. They've been doing this now since the 1990s. Every report shows increasing trends in climate, both with respect to warming, but also changes in precipitation patterns. Generally, temperature patterns across the globe are rising, almost everywhere. Precipitation patterns are also shifting, but in a less predictable way. And this is partly due to how we predict such things. Because of air circulation, the general trends in temperature all go in the same direction, but because of prevailing wind patterns and continental forces, you can have some areas in the future that will see more rain and some that will see less rain. However, there are significant regional variations. So it's impossible to assume that these trends are going to be the same for everybody. And when you think of temperature and precipitation as two sides of important agricultural production, you can see that there's going to be winners and losers in this. More of the warming is going on in the northern hemisphere than in the southern. This is partly as a result of the larger continental masses that are in the northern hemispheres of the planet. I'll show you some graphs and figures later on that demonstrate how much the north is warming. This is not to say that in the future in the south, like Antarctica, we're not going to see considerable climate change, but this might not happen till the mid part of this century or even the second half of it. However, we are already seeing significant warming in some places in Antarctica already. We're going to see lots more surface water at the poles, especially the North Pole. One, because there's going to be more precipitation, but two, it's going to be surface water because it's not going to be frozen anymore. And we're seeing an increasing amount of melting permafrost and melting glaciers at the same time. The last thing I want to say is the only reason that the IPCC forecasts go out to the year 2100 is because it's a nice convenient number. It's sort of the limit that climatologists have put to say that we can make predictions about the climate out to this year without getting into science fiction, because after that it becomes a very spurious cause. But believe you me, the effects of climate change are going to last for thousands of years. So I know it's an easy thing for me to say, to think about your children and the world they inherit, or your children's children. And I tell the students in my class, I said, you know, when this gets to be a problem about mid-century, I'll probably be retired or dead by now, and this is going to be your problem. But if you think that this problem is even going to be worse next century, it's harder to put into context your children's children's children having to deal with this problem. But that's exactly what's going to happen, because it's going to take thousands of years for all this stuff that we've put in the atmosphere to decompose. This may last 10,000 years before we get back to normal levels of temperature. That being said, what's a normal temperature? Some people say, well, warmer temperatures are good. We won't have as high heating bills. Other people say, well, this is going to change the normal geologic and natural cycles. Some people say that in general, there are cycles of ice ages every 50,000 years. Guess what? We had one about 50,000 years ago, and they're now saying the reason we're not having one now is because of climate change. We have delayed the next glaciation period. So, here is a picture of the planet by temperature forecasts. You will see that the areas of the world are not divided by countries, but by biogeographic forecasting zones that are used by climatologists. The darker the reddish colors, the higher the degree of climate change. And the very darkest red indicates an increase in temperature of 12 degrees Celsius. 12 degrees Celsius. And that's extending for most of the North Pole, areas that will probably be major shipping zones in the not too near future. Also into continental North America and Eurasia, because of the heat effect of continents is capturing the heat more. And you can see that there is even more temperature increases throughout the United States and the West, although here in the East it's going to be moderated. You'll see that the Sahara Desert is red. It's going to get hotter in the Sahara Desert. I understand it's pretty hot there already. It's going to get hotter. You'll see throughout Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, places like that, significant warming. Throughout Saudi Arabia, significant warming. And other parts of South Africa. all of Africa will see some sort of increase in temperature. In the north, it will be more significant. But you can see it's much more pronounced in the northern parts of the planet than in the southern parts. Now, here are precipitation forecasts. Again, these are less uniform across the world. The greater the green color, the more the precipitation. The greater the yellow colors, the less the precipitation. So you can see that we might have more precipitation across the Pacific Ocean. This is partly due because the heating of the oceans of the world, and especially around this area, that is starting to spawn the next generation of El Niños. In fact, there was a recent El Nino event that started and hit Mexico. It's been in the paper the last few days, where the Pacific Ocean was 90 degrees in temperature, and that was what accelerated it so quickly. This is unprecedented. Now, in terms of less precipitation, you can see there's going to be a big band in Mexico, northern South America, and eastern South America. They're going to see less precipitation. Throughout the Middle East and North Africa, less precipitation. Again, the Sahara is going to get hotter and get less rain. You'll see South Africa and some parts of southern West Africa are going to see less precipitation. Although in some central parts of Africa, you might in fact see a lot more. This has a lot to do with prevailing wind patterns. You can see Australia there is experiencing significant droughts. Although India and the subcontinent there might see more precipitation. There's also a feedback effect. When you have more temperature increases, there is more evaporation of standing water. So at the same time that you might have less precipitation, there might be less flowing water because higher temperature levels are going to cause it to evaporate more quickly. Let me talk about the most recent report that came out from the IPCC and just some of the highlights from it. First of all, it shows that there's going to be more temperature rise and higher sea levels than they had forecast before. They're using something to depict future trends called representative pathways. At the low end, a representative pathway represents virtually little temperature fluctuation from now over the next 100 years. At the higher end, they have a scenario that shows significant. As they do these representative pathways over time, the likelihood of the low-end forecasts are becoming less and less likely, and the likelihood of the higher-end forecasts are going up. What there is based on is something called radiative forcing, which is how much energy is coming from the sun and how much energy we're losing from the planet. We are now adding more from the Earth due to radiative forcing so that we've switched the balance such that the planet is heating up as a result. So let me just show you a few more charts here. Again, here's a comparison. I mentioned the high value, which is called RCP 2.6. That's the low value. And you can see the forecast there. What I showed you were the mid values before. And there on the right-hand side is RCP 8.5. That's the high-end forecast. Notice in that one, most of the planet now is red. So the earlier one that I showed you was the middle forecast. Now if you think, well, maybe the high-end forecasts are becoming more and more likely the norm, you're seeing red areas across almost every continent, and Africa is totally red. Changes in precipitation are much more significant. In the lower end forecast to the left, you'll see some moderations, but in the one to the right, you'll see many more yellow colors, which indicates greater and greater precipitation drops. Again, throughout southern Africa, South America, Australia, the Middle East, you're seeing these trends there. And lastly, it's showing for the high and the low forecasts, the northern hemisphere sea ice extent. To the left is the low end that shows significant amount of glaciated ice still in the Arctic. By the year 2100, that's going to be all gone. That will change shipping patterns. They just widened the Panama Canal to accommodate newer, larger ships. A lot of people are saying, well, that's going to be unnecessary in about 20 years. And that a lot of shipping is going to move to other places. One question is, are they going to use the Suez Canal as much? You know, you got ships that are lined up there trying to get through. You've got a problem of piracy there. You can ship stuff from China to North America and Europe through the Arctic. That gets there about half the time. All they have to do is reinforce the hulls of their ships so they can make this journey. So these shipping patterns are going to affect Africa too. In some cases, it might make it easier, some places harder. When these climate change occur, it's also important between the different forecasts. And again, I'm showing you the high forecast in orange and the low forecast in light blue there. Out to about the year 2050, there isn't much difference between these trends. And you'll see that the lines barely start to diverge about the year 2050. But by the end of the century, the forecast for the higher end scenarios is about 4 degrees centigrade for the planet. And the lower end is only about 0.5 degrees higher. This says if we're going to do something about this, we've got a window of 50 years to do it. The problem is, so much stuff has already been put in the atmosphere through 250 years of industrialization and through 10,000 years of cutting down trees around the world, that even if we signed a major climate deal tomorrow that involved the United States, China, and all the major emitters in the world, this will not change trends for 30 or 40 years. We have a window of 10 to 20 years now to do something. I don't see that things are going to happen that are going to be that significant to change the trends. We might slow them down, but I think people around the world, at least decision makers, have come to the conclusion that we need to accept climate change, adapt to it, mitigate it where we can, but we cannot stop it at this point. It is a fact of life. Again, if we go region by region here, you'll see in the Arctic there's the drop in sea ice. That's what the indicator is. But the rest are for temperatures. Every single continent is seeing rises in temperatures over this period. And you can see Africa right there is going to see, in some cases, up to 1 degree centigrade higher. A significant difference between the low and high forecasts. But everywhere in the world is experiencing this same phenomenon. I kind of wanted to lay a context for you to get you thinking about the dimensions of this problem and the evidence that's out there. There's a lot we don't know about climate change. And if you think about the simple task of putting together a model that will take data for the last 100 or 200 years, put it into this model, extrapolate out almost a century, and try to come up with detailed forecasts for the entire planet, that's a pretty hard project. What we need to do next is start figuring out what's the role of people and improving how we understand the sociological impacts of climate on humanity. Is it going to make some parts of the world poorer? Is it going to lead to more wars in some parts of the world? What exactly does it mean for people? Because it's easy to talk about a temperature going up, but unless we know how that is affecting us, or even producing feedback, we're going to be underestimating the problem and not dealing with it. But we would probably need something like a Manhattan-level project in order to adequately model this in a way that accounts for the role of human beings. But that has to be the next step. We just can't build models that don't include human factors. In fact, there's going to be a convergence between population trends and climate trends about the year 2050, and they're going to be hitting at the same time. This will change national power capabilities around the world. And you're going to see substantial shifts in resources between countries, and populations. You're also going to have some questions about sovereignty. I've mentioned the Arctic, and because of the melting there, a lot of countries want to start claiming areas or increasing their exclusive economic zone. You know, a few years ago, the Russians actually planted a flag on the seabed of the North Pole because they wanted to claim the North Pole. But Denmark, who owns Greenland, also claims it, and so does Canada. The United States has a dispute with Canada over parts of the Arctic Sea, where there are thought to be oil and gas reserves. The United States also has some differences with the Russians around Alaska and the Barents Sea over some boundary issues. And so this could be a flashpoint in the future. But it's also going to start inundating islands around the world in the next 20 or 30 years. And they're going to be looking for other places to move to. The small country of the Maldives has already requested asylum of sorts in other countries because their island will be submerged at some point. The only reason it's really above water now is because Japan has paid for a big wall around the island that keeps the sea out. They are in the Indian Ocean. Because of cultural differences, they've asked Sri Lanka and India if they could relocate there, and they've also asked Australia about that. Other countries in the Pacific have already approached Australia about moving there. Now, will countries like the Comoros Islands and other small islands off of Africa be requesting asylum in other parts of Africa as well? Or other low-lying islands? And what are the implications of this? If you leave your island because it is submerged, technically that's no longer a landmass that can be claimed. Which is one reason the Chinese are fast building up these islands in the Southeast Asia area before they become submerged and can no longer be claimed. And what are the rights of these people? Because, as I said, after 10,000 years or something like that, climate change may ameliorate and these islands will once again pop up. Will this be like governments in exile during World War II, where countries can just come back many years later and claim this? Can divers go down and start picking through their stuff that's at the bottom on these islands that are underwater now and therefore not technically an island? Who owns these things? We haven't even started this discussion. And there's a very large contingent of about 40 countries that fall into this category that has a significant voting bloc within the United Nations, the small island developing countries. They are going to be the first tests of this. And I don't see any indication that we're doing anything to help them out. And this is leading to a lot of immigration. And Australia has seen this, and I was there a couple of weeks ago, on the islands in the South Pacific, where high population growth rates, limited economic opportunities, are leading sometimes to political and ethnic differences on islands. And Australia has to send troops there, or else it has to send aid to keep the peace and to keep these economies going. The climate models use as inputs forecasts of the future. That's part of the reason why the models differentiate between the low and the high degree of climate change. And here are some of the forecasts they use. These are from different organizations. Most of them are from the United Nations. IIASA is the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna. And you see that there's a very wide difference in population forecasts in the future. At the bottom, you see that one forecast says we're going to be at 7 billion and we're going to rise up to about 10 billion, then we're going to drop down to 6 billion. I think that's kind of fantasy thinking, but that's some of the forecasts based on demographic trends. And the hope that widespread family planning practices and economic development in developing countries will bring down birth rates. So there is some hope built into these forecasts. On the other hand, at the top there, you'll see a forecast of 18 billion Again, we're at 7 billion now, so more than doubling of the world's population. The more people there are, the more carbon they produce, and the more carbon they produce, the higher the temperature forecast. There's a really direct relationship between the number of people there are in the world and climate change. Now, when I say the drivers of climate change, of course, everybody thinks about what we put in the atmosphere, which is CO2, sulfur dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, nitrous dioxide, and other aerosols. But the second largest leading cause of climate change is deforestation. The cutting down of trees and taking out these carbon sinks, and at the same time that they're often being burnt and throws a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, is the second leading cause of climate change. Now, if we have 18 billion people, that's 11 billion more mouths to feed. How are we going to provide more food without cutting down more forests or going to genetically modified organisms, which is a problem into itself for some countries? So this is the starting point, I say, is how many people are there going to be? And what's the relationship of the climate change and the ability of developing countries' populations to make the transition to be more developed and change the family size? So, let me talk about climate feedback. Part of this comes from an article by Kelly Smith and Cox. And what they say is the climate models fail to fully account for feedback that may accelerate or slow rates of climate change or make adaptation more difficult. Why is this happening? What is the feedback here? The feedback is when you have increasing temperatures and less precipitation, this hits the agricultural sector. Most of Africa's population works in the agricultural sector. Some of this is for subsistence. Some of it is to earn income. And if they're going to have worse agricultural productivity, how are they going to send their kids to school and earn money to go through the demographic transition? This is going to hurt their incomes. Secondly, the people that fall in this category are people in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. This is where you see the highest dependent on agricultural incomes in the world. And it is on them that we're relying they go through this demographic transition to reduce climate change. But they're the ones who are going to be hurt by it the most. When? Well, they're making assumptions that a lot of this demographic transition is going to happen about mid-century. But if we take this feedback into account, that's going to push maybe the demographic transition back by 20, 30, 40 years. And when you do the calculations for this, that's adding even more billions of people every year. By pushing this demographic transition date, that is when 2 people produce 2 people on average for the planet, that's going to add more and more people because we push the date that the planet goes through this process back further and further in time. This should be the reason why developed countries should be helping developing countries, is because we're counting on them to do this, to help with climate change, but at the same time, we're not really offering much in terms of ways out of the problem. We're seeing a growing inequality in the world. These trends will make them worse, but I've taken some UN data here, and I've taken some countries from sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia and used them as indicators. What the World Bank now defines as the least developed countries of the world. In the year 1950, that was 7.7 of the global population, 7.7%. By the year 2020, it'll be 13.6 or more than doubled. So inequality is growing around the world, irrespective of climate change, and has been doing so over the last half century. For those same countries, and I'm taking into account that some will go through the demographic transition, some will become developed, about 1/4 of the world's population will be least developed in the year 2100. If we just use the broader category of lesser development, about 1/4 was lesser developed in 2050. By year 2100, that'll be over half the world's population. We're seeing a more and more unequal world. That's a dangerous world, in my opinion. If you had something like that in the United States, which we saw like during the Depression, you'd have a major social movement. You'd have a revolution. But if there are different countries in different parts of the world, people think they can accept that. I think that's a dangerous world. Let's break down the demographic data even further. The top line there is actually Asia, with 4.7 billion people by the year 2100. Notice that Asia actually peaks about mid-century and then actually starts to decline. If you think about this in context too, Asia is going to go through some fundamental changes. One, if you look at countries like Japan, Korea, their birth rates are going way, way down. Japan is one of the fastest declining countries in the world in terms of population. And China, because the one-child policy, is going to peak at about 1.5 billion and then drop below 1 billion by the end of the century. So this increase that you see in Asia, or even the high levels, is mostly because of other countries. The red is Africa. By the end of this century, Africa will almost catch Asia in terms of population. This is the global majority. Notice down here at the bottom you have North America and South America. That's pretty flat. And Europe. They're not growing at all. Let's look at some countries now. At the top you see India. Again, they peak around mid-century, but they're going to wind up at about 1.5 billion plus by the year 2100. China will drop down to about 1,000. The green is Nigeria, who will be almost as big as China by the year 2100. I can guarantee you by the year 2200, Nigeria will pass China. You can also see the United States in blue, Indonesia, that's pretty flat. So you see very different patterns there. Again, here's the developing countries in context. The United States is still growing, but Japan, the UK, Germany, South Korea, they're all declining in population. So when you think about these numbers and the growing population, it's because developed countries are going to be going way, way down, and developing countries are going up even faster than what the aggregate numbers suggest. This is something else called the dependency ratio, which is the ratio of people in the workforce over those not in the workforce. So that includes children and retirees. Right now, Africa, because of the number of young people there, has a very high dependency ratio, or very low dependency ratio, about 1-to-1. So there's about 1 worker for every retiree or child in Africa. But in the other parts of the world, it's about 2-to-1. So you have about 2 workers to 1 retiree or child in the United States or Europe or other places. By the end of the century, that's going to reverse. Because of the aging of North Americans, Europeans, East Asians, they're going to be at that 1-to-1 ratio, and the ratio of 2-to-1 workers to 1 is going to be in Africa. Africa will be the manufacturing center of the world, just like China is now, because that's where the youth bulge is going to be. The world is going to rely on them for economic productivity, just by the demographics of when working age people will be. So some of the recent population projections, and the United Nations has come up with some slightly different ways of doing forecasting. They're seeing now that rather than leveling off at mid-century, population will grow past the year 2100. Birth rates are not falling as fast as we thought they would. The new population estimates for the year 2100 are 9 to 13 billion, or much higher than that low level I showed before. And in Africa, the demographic transition is not occurring, and they confirm what I just showed you, about 4 billion people will live there, and that'll be about 1/3 of the world's population. So here's what I call the termites in the forecasts and why they're going to be worse than we thought. One, a stalling of agricultural productivity in developing countries. Two, a stalling of economic growth and therefore the demographic transition. Three, the persistence of high population growth rates that don't seem to be coming down as fast as we once thought. Fourth, if we think about the fact that to reduce climate change, we are going to have to decouple economic growth from carbon, and carbon adds about 1% to economic growth. If we start using less carbon to meet climate forecasts, that's going to slow down growth even more. Fifth, in these periods of uncertainty, is there sufficient government institutional stability to control what's going to be happening in these areas? And rather than what we hoped would be a kind of soft landing between the demographic and climate trends, we're going to see an abrupt landing that's going to be much more dangerous. So, how does this eventually get us to conflict? And I'm not one of those people who, like a kid with a hammer, tries to beat on everything. But there are indirect ways that climate can contribute to conflict, or what some people refer to as a multiplier force or multiplier threat. One, if you get too much precipitation at certain times, and we'll see more extreme events, that could hurt spring planting. It could hurt when you're doing your fall harvest. Just by the fact that we're changing around precipitation patterns to different times of the year might affect agricultural productivity. One scholar finds that there's more of a link to temperature than precipitation because it's more predictable. But that this is a long-term process, and you don't see an XY relationship happening in the same year. That is to say, if we're having a climate drought in one year, or any kind of drought, we don't see conflict the same year. Because the first year, the farmer and his or her family will have some stored up reserves, maybe a little money in the bank, maybe some extra crops from the previous year, they'll use those up. The next year, they'll start digging deeper and deeper into their pockets if the climate problem persists. The third year, they start selling off some of their animals, especially the larger ones, keeping the goats and maybe the sheeps. Fourth year, they sell off the goats. Fifth year, they sell off the seed corn. Sixth year, they sell off their house. So you may see climate droughts in year X, but not see the impact till 10 years later. And that's what makes it so pernicious. It doesn't happen at the same time, but it starts a domino effect that eventually occurs. Burke estimated by the year 2030, you'll see 393,000 extra battle deaths in sub-Saharan Africa due to increasing temperatures. I like to call this new world a world where we have hot wars and cold wars, which was the title of my book. Hot wars are wars that have been going on for a long time around the equator. And this is what's going to hit Africa. These are areas that are already hot or warm and are going to get hotter. These are historical conflicts that have been going on for a long time. There have been drying throughout the Middle East and areas like that for thousands of years. In fact, I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, the Fertile Crescent from the Middle East. That describes a band that stretches roughly from Baghdad to Jerusalem, a band of green that was described, I think, in the Bible and ancient texts. There's no Fertile Crescent anymore. People came and cut down the trees in Lebanon, like the cedars of Lebanon, floated them down the Tigris-Euphrates to build the cities of Iraq in ancient times because there were no trees there. Then they brought in goats and sheep that ate all the saplings. And over time, this changed the environment so that that area is now semi-scrubbed. There aren't forests there anymore. This is not the Fertile Crescent. But this climate change, aided in part by human activity, has been going on for a long, long time. These are also wars of declining resources, often related to civil wars, not country-to-country wars. And it's just going to make a hot situation hotter. What's new is the northern wars where cold areas are becoming hot. This is opening up new resources for countries who happen to be developed. This is more likely to be a country-to-country dispute more than a civil dispute. And this is actually, in some cases, an opportunity. Like I said, there's going to be big regional variations. For some parts of Canada, the United States, and Russia, they're actually going to be winners out of climate change. For Africa and South Asia, they're going to be losers. You know, politicians, there are some in Russia and Canada who say, climate change, great! I can grow more crops. We can get to the oil now. We can have ships going through the Arctic. This is great. How can we make climate change go faster? Hence the reluctance to sign a climate change deal. This is political. They're making out. Why stop it? There's got to be some politics involved in these decisions. Even the United States, the people in the West that are seeing these huge droughts now are worried about climate change. In the East, we've had excess rain this year. Summer's not been too bad. And you know, in summer in DC, the old joke is you take a shower in the morning and spend the rest of the day drying off. Hasn't been too bad at all. They're not seeing much climate increase around here at all. We're going to have lower heating bills. Some people are going to actually be better off with climate change. So, how do we get from climate change to conflict? One, as I said, it's indirect. We see only rare cases like with major catastrophes or monsoons or something like that where we see direct impacts between climate change and conflict. These are very indirect, take many years to surface, and are often hard to spot. Secondly, in conflict analysis, there's always a lot of factors to account for conflicts. Historical differences, ethnic differences, political differences, sovereignty claims, past grievances between countries, socioeconomic differences. There's lots of reasons why people go to war, but now climate just adds one more factor. And maybe it'll be the tipping point where these other factors maybe didn't all put together to cause conflict, but now that's pushed it over the edge. The other factor is what I want to call structural changes and triggers. That is, climate change and demographics set up the stage for possible conflict. When you have people who don't have opportunity, where they're exceeding the carrying capacity of the land to provide for them, you're setting the stage for conflict. You're not causing conflict themselves. So you take the case, say, in Syria. Well, Syria had a rising population that was educated. They had many ethnic groups for as long as there's been Syrians. But they had a terrible drought in the early 2000s. So a lot of Syrian farmers actually had to give up farming and started moving into the cities. And there were different populations moving around the countries. You had Shia who were living in the east and Sunnis suddenly mixing more in ways they hadn't seen before the drought. And this all came together with some demonstrations around the Arab Spring. And that's what led to the conflict. Was the Arab Spring set into motion factors that had been brewing for a long time. Let me give you one other example from Tunisia, which was one of the countries that was the originators of the Arab Spring. And Tunisia had a growing population, educated workforce, but it had a stagnant economy for many years and not many opportunities for people who were well educated. So what set off the war in Tunisia that eventually overthrew the government and started the Arab Spring? It was when an Arab who was a well-educated person was a vegetable seller, and the military were trying to close him down, and he said, look, I've got no opportunities here. Now you're shutting down my vegetable stand. So he poured gasoline on himself and lit himself on fire. That was the trigger that set it off. In the same way that the conflict in Rwanda was not set off by long-standing grievances by Tutsis and Hutus, and I'm oversimplifying this, but by the shooting down of the president's plane. So you have structural conditions that set these, like you're putting together wood, and then somebody throws a match in the fire. What I'm saying is these matches are the dangerous thing, but once you have a lot of brush there, the conditions for starting fires get more and more likely. As I mentioned, climate change and conflict involve lags. They don't occur in the same year. You'll also see some countries where they're going to have more resource abundance, like in the north. They're going to have more access to agricultural products, to energy, and some areas in the south that might see more scarcity. And when you have abundance and scarcity, people who are in scarce conditions want to take advantage of the abundant conditions. You'll have, by the same token, migration factors, push and pull factors. People in scarce conditions are going to be pushed out of their country. People in better conditions are going to be pulling in refugees. Often it decimates both communities or causes them trouble, because when a large number of people move away from a community, it leaves fractures in the community, because especially a lot of times these are young men who leave. But at the same time, a lot of new people moving into an area might destroy the fabric of the existing society. So when these things become big and sudden, it actually harms both the people who are migrating and where they are migrating to. And lastly, there's the so-called full and empty belly theories of war. Do people go to war after they've had a good harvest and they have a lot of stocks or resources stored up? Or do they go to war when they're starving and have no other alternatives? These are both explanations that people use for climate and conflict and the relationship. So here's just a map of future conflicts from the Department of Defense. And you see that they're estimating more conflicts in East Africa, around the Mediterranean, and around Southeast Asia. Here's something I've put together. Again, I'm using the climate biogeographic regions about deaths from conflict from 1945 to today. This is from the Stockholm International Peace Resources Institute. And you can see that based on data from 1945, the darkest area, Southeast Asia, had a lot of conflict. East Africa, South Asia, the Mediterranean. Think back to those climate maps I showed you. These are the areas where you're going to see the most climate change too, is where we've had the most conflict. Now, these may just be correlations, but you can't ignore the fact that these are going on in the same parts of the world, and they might feed trends. State failures in the world. These are, again, in countries that we talk about climate problems occurring. Climate and conflict hotspots around the world. Again, Mexico, Central Caribbean, areas that I showed were having more precipitation. Across the Sahel there, in Northern Africa and Southern Africa, in Central Asia, South Asia, and East Asia. These are all predicted climate and conflict hotspots in the world. Here's some rainfall data I got for Africa showing the change in length of growing season out to the year 2050. The darkest brown there is 50 to 113 fewer days in a growing season. Now, if you think of the high end of that 113 days, that's a third of the year less. And you'll see that there are pockets in West Africa where that's going to be taking place, and around the Great Lakes region in the east. These are also the most populated parts of Africa, where we're going to see the greatest drop in growing season. You will see that in the center of the country, Congo, Kenya, Tanzania, they're going to see actually greater growing seasons. But all this brown area is somewhere between, say, 1 and 113 fewer days. So you see much more brown than you do green in this map. And this kind of highlights the problem I was talking about. Shorter growing seasons can't be good for incomes. And again, here's population densities, which are the highest around the same areas you're seeing the big drops in growing season. So, some people call this new era the Anthropocene Era, or the Age of Humans. There was some talk about actually naming this as a geologic era. You're going to see growing inequality increased by climate change. You're going to see the need that we include people in climate forecasts, because what people do to climate and what climate does to people, it's part of the story. There's a feedback there that is not being captured by models right now. The soft landing window has probably closed, so we need to think of some contingency plans in case there is a hard landing. In some places of the world, we're only going to be able to adapt. we're not going to be able to change trends. Our impact is going to last for thousands of years, and we have to instill this mentality that this is a very long-term problem. And that this trend may last up to 50,000 years, which I think maybe can help people put this in perspective about how big this problem is. And it's not something lightly that we can just read about in the paper and think, well, we'll solve that tomorrow. So, if I could stop and ask you to give me some questions now. For example, how do we fit all the factors that impact climate and conflict trends into a model that makes sense? This is not going to be easy. How far off in the future should we be planning? Is it preventable? What can we do to adapt, and when? I invite your questions and comments.